The storm had settled heavily over the mountains, thunder groaning across the darkened sky while rain lashed against the old timber cabin. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed, the only light filling the room with a restless glow. He had thought the place empty when he came back from the ridge that evening, soaked through from the sudden downpour, his boots heavy with mud. Yet as he pushed open the door, he had felt something different, an uneasy stillness, as if the room had been waiting for him. It was when he laid his hand on the latch to the small side chamber that he heard the faintest rustle. His breath caught, his body stiffened, and for a long moment, he simply stood in silence. Then, with one careful push, he opened the door. She was there, crouched low in the corner, her white dress damp and dirt-stained, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. A bride, her veil torn, her hands trembling as if she had been running for her life. He had not expected to find anyone, let alone a woman like her. She looked at him as though he were both her captor and her only salvation. For a long time neither spoke, until her lips moved in a voice as fragile as the rain outside. "Please, don't send me away." Something in the way she said it, the desperate weight behind her words, struck him deep. He stepped back, giving her space, his voice steady but quiet. "You're safe here. No one will harm you." She studied him, searching his face as though testing whether she could believe him, and then, with a sigh of surrender, she lowered her head. He brought her bread and water, and though her hands shook as she ate, he saw how hunger gave way to relief. Still, she said little, as though words had been stolen from her by whatever she had fled. When he asked her name, she only whispered, "They call me a bride, but I never chose to be." Hours passed. The storm did not lift, but in its furious pounding, the cabin became a place apart from the world, as if only the two of them existed. She sat near the fire, her soaked dress steaming in the warmth, and for the first time since he had returned, he saw a trace of calm in her eyes. It was then she spoke again, her voice softer, trembling less than before. "You will sleep beside me tonight." He froze at the words, his chest tightening. She had not spoken them as an invitation of desire, but as a plea for safety, for the closeness of another soul against the vast loneliness that had haunted her. The way she said it was not commanding, but fragile, as if she feared that the darkness would swallow her if she lay alone. For years, he had lived alone in that cabin, a man bound by silence and distance from the world beyond the mountain. Loneliness had become his companion, steady and cold. Yet here, before him, was someone who carried her own loneliness, heavier still, a burden pressed upon her by hands that had forced her into a life she did not want. He stoked the fire, let the warmth spread, and when he returned to her side, he saw she was trembling, not from the cold, but from the memory of what she had escaped. Without speaking, he laid his blanket on the bed and let her rest upon it. Then, after a long moment, he sat beside her, his presence steady and unthreatening. Her head turned toward him, her veil slipping away, revealing the softness of her face, the sorrow etched into her eyes. For a while, neither moved. Outside, the storm raged, but within the cabin, time slowed. Slowly, she leaned against him, her breath warm against his shoulder. He felt the weight of her exhaustion, the quiet surrender of someone who had carried fear too long. As the firelight flickered, she whispered again, the same words, though now they carried something gentler. "You will sleep beside me tonight." This time, he did not resist. He laid himself next to her, not touching, simply present, a barrier against the emptiness that haunted them both. And in that silence, she closed her eyes, her breath deepening, the first hint of peace softening her features. He watched her as the night deepened, knowing that whatever fate had brought her to his cabin, it had bound their loneliness together. Outside, the world raged, but inside, for the first time in years, he was no longer alone. She had asked him to stay beside her, and in that fragile closeness, something unspoken began to take root, something neither of them dared to name, yet both had long hungered for. The storm did not ease through the night. The cabin walls shook as the wind screamed down from the ridges, carrying with it the smell of pine and broken earth. Lightning carved white scars through the darkness, and the rain hammered the roof so fiercely it seemed as though the whole mountain might give way. Inside, the fire kept its steady glow, a fragile circle of warmth in a world of chaos. He had grown used to such nights. For years he had endured the isolation of his mountain home, listening to storms as though they were voices of old ghosts. Yet tonight was different, for tonight he was not alone. She lay there in the dim light, her body curled beneath the blanket he had given her, the torn veil falling away to reveal hair tangled from rain and wind. She looked like a figure carved from sorrow, her hands folded near her chest as though she were still bracing herself against unseen danger. He had not asked her what she was running from, though the truth of it clung to her like a shadow. A bride who had not chosen her vows, a woman bound to a life she did not want, forced into white lace that had become her chains. He had seen enough of men and the ways they claimed women as possessions to understand without needing every detail. When she had whispered those words, "You will sleep beside me tonight," he had felt the echo of his own solitude resound in her plea. For years he had not heard a human voice inside his cabin except his own, muttered into silence. He had forgotten the weight of companionship, forgotten the sound of someone breathing close by. She had not asked for passion, not for touch, but for presence, and in that request lay something he recognized too well, the hunger not to face the dark alone. He sat against the bed frame, watching the fire sink into coals. She slept unevenly, her breath catching now and then as though dreams dragged her back into the terror she had fled. He wanted to tell her she was safe, but he knew words sometimes held no power against memory. Instead, he stayed where she could feel him, steady and silent, so when she woke with a start, her hand trembling against the mattress, she would know he had not abandoned her. In the dim hours before dawn, her eyes opened. For a moment, confusion clouded them, then softened when she saw him still there. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but she only drew a deeper breath and let it out slowly. He turned his gaze away, not wanting to pin her down with questions she might not be ready to answer. Silence was sometimes the only kindness. The morning came slowly. The storm had broken, leaving the world drenched and heavy with mist. The cabin smelled of damp wood and smoke. He rose, his joints stiff, and stepped outside to gather water. The world was washed clean, yet fragile, as though the earth itself had been broken open by the night's rage. When he returned, she was sitting upright, her dress still clinging in patches of dampness, her hair falling about her shoulders. The veil lay crumpled at her side, forgotten. "You stayed," she said, her voice low, almost uncertain, as though she had expected him to vanish with the dawn. "I said you were safe here," he replied, setting down the water. She studied him then, her gaze searching, as if trying to decide whether safety was something she could truly trust. Slowly, she lifted the cup he offered and drank, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting moment. That brief touch startled him more than he expected. It had been years since anyone's hand had met his, and hers carried a warmth that unsettled the stillness inside him. Through the morning, she said little, but her presence filled the cabin in ways silence could not. She walked the small space, tracing her fingers over the rough wood walls, looking at the shelves stacked with tools and books, touching the old photographs yellowed by time. She seemed to be searching for something, proof, perhaps, that this place was real, that it was not another prison like the one she had escaped. When the fire burned low, she turned to him. "You live alone here?" "Yes," he said simply. Her brows drew together, the faintest crease of sorrow shadowing her face. "It must be lonely." He did not answer. Loneliness had become a part of him so long ago it felt less like an absence and more like a second skin. To speak of it seemed useless. Yet in her words he heard recognition, as if she carried the same silence within herself. By midday, the mist outside began to lift, and sunlight broke through the cracks in the clouds. He stepped outside to chop wood, his hands steady with the rhythm of the axe. She stood in the doorway watching, the hem of her dress brushing against the threshold. For a moment, she looked almost like a figure from some forgotten vision, a bride standing at the edge of two worlds, the one she had fled and the one she had stumbled into. When he paused, she stepped out, the sunlight falling across her face. For the first time, he saw her smile, small, hesitant, but real. "It's quiet here," she said softly, as though she feared to break the silence. "It always is," he answered. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond the woods. "It's the kind of quiet that makes you hear yourself." Her words lingered with him long after she went back inside. He worked the day as he always did, tending to the land, mending fences, checking the traps along the ridge. Yet everywhere he went, her presence shadowed him, not as a weight but as a tether, pulling his thoughts back to the cabin. For the first time in years, he felt no urgency to return to emptiness. That night, when the sun sank and the fire crackled once more, she sat near him, her knees drawn close, her eyes reflecting the flames. "I thought I would never feel safe again," she whispered. He turned to her, waiting, but she did not speak further. Her gaze dropped, as though the weight of memory pressed too heavily. Instead, she shifted closer until her shoulder brushed his. He did not move away. He let her lean against him, her breath slow, her body trembling less than before. The night carried them into silence, and when she whispered once more, her words were softer, filled with fragile trust. "You will sleep beside me tonight." This time, there was no hesitation in his answer. He lay beside her, the firelight warming the shadows, and though their bodies did not touch beyond the closeness of space, a thread stronger than words began to bind them. She slept, her breath steady now, and he closed his eyes for the first time in years without the hollow ache of solitude pressing against him. The mountain had given him storms, silence, and years of isolation. Now it had given him something he had not known he was waiting for, a stranger whose presence had turned his cabin from shelter into sanctuary. He did not yet know her past, nor what dangers might follow her, but as the night deepened, he knew one thing with certainty. She had asked him to stay beside her, and he would. The next morning arrived with a gentler air. The storm had passed, leaving the mountains awash with sunlight and the scent of pine needles drying in the warmth. He rose early, his body tuned to the rhythm of labor, yet for the first time in years, he did not rush outside. He lingered near the bed, watching her still asleep, the veil crumpled at her side, the faint rise and fall of her chest steady against the hush of the cabin. For a fleeting moment, he let himself believe the world had been remade in silence, that the burdens of yesterday had been washed away by rain. When she stirred, her eyes opening to meet his, there was a softness he had not seen before. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, almost shy, as though she were unaccustomed to being met with tenderness at the break of day. He offered her coffee, and she accepted, her fingers brushing his again with that same startling warmth. Through the hours, she walked the small cabin as though learning it piece by piece. She asked about the shelves, about the tools, about the books whose spines had been worn from his solitary nights. She listened when he spoke, her eyes intent, as though his words were worth more than he himself believed. She told little of herself, but now and then fragments slipped through, the church bells that had rung on the morning she was dressed as a bride, the heavy carriage that had carried her into a union she had not chosen, the faces of men who spoke of her as though she were currency. He did not press her for more. He understood too well that some truths cut deeper when spoken aloud. Instead, he gave her space, letting her story unfold in her own time, piece by piece, like water finding its way through stone. Days turned to nights, and nights folded into days. She stayed, as if the cabin had become her refuge, and in that time, the rhythm of solitude shifted. Where once there had been silence, now there was the sound of her laughter, quiet, uncertain, but growing stronger. Where once the bed had been wide with emptiness, now there was the warmth of another presence, her whispered request each night the same, and his answer always given in steady silence. Yet with each day, he felt a growing weight pressing against the walls of his heart. She was not meant to live in hiding forever. Whatever she had fled, whatever vows she had been forced into, the world would not let go so easily. He knew it, though neither of them spoke it aloud. One evening, as the sky burned crimson over the ridge, she sat with him by the fire. Her hands were folded, her gaze distant, the flicker of flame reflecting in her eyes. "Do you ever wonder," she said quietly, "why some of us are given lives we never chose?" He looked at her, seeing not only the woman before him but the years that had been stolen from her. "I wonder it every day," he answered. Her gaze returned to his, searching, as though the weight of his words revealed a wound she had not seen before. "And what do you do with the wondering?" He leaned back, the fire crackling between them. "You live anyway. Some days you fight, some days you endure, some days you just breathe and wait for the next morning." She held his eyes, and then, with a trembling breath, whispered, "You make it sound simple." "It's not," he said, "but it's all I know." Her hand lifted then, hesitating before resting lightly against his. The gesture was small, yet it carried more than words could hold. "Then teach me," she murmured. The fire burned lower, and the cabin fell into shadow, but her hand did not leave his. That night, when she whispered again for him to sleep beside her, the words carried not only fear but trust, a deepening thread binding them. He lay there listening to her breath steady against the darkness, and he knew that whatever storms the world would bring, he would not let her face them alone. But the world did come. It was 3 weeks after she first appeared in his cabin when the sound of hooves broke the quiet of the valley. He heard them before he saw them, the unmistakable rhythm of horses carrying more than travelers. He looked out from the ridge where he was splitting wood and saw 2 riders making their way toward the cabin. His chest tightened. The world she had fled had found its trail. He returned quickly, his steps heavy with urgency. She was inside, humming faintly to herself as she folded one of his shirts she had washed by the river. The sound stopped when she saw his face. "What is it?" she whispered. "Riders," he said simply. Her hands went still. The color drained from her face, and for a moment she seemed frozen, like prey hearing the approach of the hunter. Then her voice cracked, almost a sob. "They've come for me." He placed his hand on her shoulder, firm and steady. "You're safe here." Tears gathered in her eyes, her strength trembling on the edge of breaking. "You don't understand. They'll never let me go. I belong to them." He met her gaze, the fire of his own solitude burning now into something sharper. "No, you don't belong to anyone." The hooves grew louder. The riders drew close, their silhouettes cutting against the light. He stepped outside, his axe still in his hand, his frame tall against the cabin. The 2 men halted their horses a short distance away, their eyes narrowing as they looked at him. "We're looking for a runaway," one called, his voice sharp with authority. "A bride who wandered from her vows." His jaw tightened. "There's no one here who belongs to you." The man's eyes narrowed further, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "This isn't a matter for you, stranger. She's promised, and she'll be taken back." Behind him, he felt her presence at the doorway, her breath uneven. He did not turn, but he knew she was listening, her fear as heavy as the storm had been that first night. "She's not yours to take," he said, his voice low, steady, unshaken. For a long moment, silence stretched, the mountain air charged with tension. Then the man leaned forward in his saddle, sneering. "You'd risk your life for a woman who doesn't belong to you." Finally, he turned his head just enough to see her, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. And in that moment, the answer was simple. "She asked me to stay beside her. That's all I need." The riders exchanged looks, measuring him, measuring her, weighing whether to press forward. The silence thickened, broken only by the restless snort of the horses. At last, with a curse, the man jerked his reins. "This isn't over," he spat, before turning back toward the trail. The sound of hooves faded, swallowed by the forest, leaving only the echo of their tread behind. When the last sound was gone, she rushed to him, her hands gripping his arms, her tears breaking free. "You don't know what you've done," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear and relief. He took her hands in his, steady, grounding her trembling. "I know," he said, "and I'd do it again." She pressed her forehead against his chest, her sobs quieting into the fabric of his shirt. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her as though to shield her not only from the men who hunted her but from the weight of the years she had carried. For the first time, she let herself break, and in breaking, she let him bear part of what had been hers alone. The days that followed were filled with unease. Every sound in the woods, every distant echo of hooves carried with it the fear of return. Yet within the cabin, something deeper took root. She began to speak more openly, telling him of the life she had escaped, of the man whose wealth had bought her like land, whose house had been built of coldness and control. She spoke of the vows spoken with her lips but not her heart, of the endless nights where silence had been her only companion until she chose to run. And he listened, not as a judge, not as a savior, but as a man who understood what it meant to live under the weight of chains unseen. Their nights together deepened. She no longer whispered only for him to stay beside her. Sometimes she whispered his name, sometimes she spoke of dreams she thought she had lost. He felt his own silence loosening, the years of solitude giving way to something he had thought long buried, the ache of belonging, the fragile joy of being needed. The mountain did not forgive easily, nor did the world beyond it, but within the walls of that cabin, they found something neither had sought and both had hungered for. In the closeness of shared breath, in the warmth of bodies lying side by side, in the quiet confessions spoken only in the dark, they built a sanctuary against the storm of the world. And though he knew the riders might return, though she knew her past might still reach for her, neither let the fear steal what had been given. For in the nights when she turned to him, her voice soft but certain, "You will sleep beside me tonight," the world outside ceased to matter. What mattered was that they had found each other in the silence, and in that finding, neither was alone again.